Hi, this is Jill from Fabric Garden in Sacramento, California, and today I wanted to talk about 3 of your essential quilting notions, how often you should replace them, why they need replacing, and how do you know when it's time to replace them. So first, I want to talk about your sewing machine needles. Many of us just sew and sew and sew, and we really don't think about replacing our sewing machine needles. But they're very important to replace. Usually about every 6 to 8 hours of sewing, they need replacing. So as a needle gets old, it gets old in 2 places. It gets old at the point, so the tip of the needle can get dull, but also the eye of the needle with the thread going through it constantly, the eye of the needle also wears. So as your needle gets old, you can see damaged or pulled threads on your fabric. You can get skipped stitches, puckered seams, and thread breakage. So if those things are starting to happen, you are long past needing to replace your sewing machine needle. What I like to do is put a little post-it note on my sewing machine, and when I change my needle, I put that date on the post-it note. I also put what type of needle I have in there, because sometimes I do change the type of needle I'm using based on the fabric that I'm using. So every 6 to 8 hours of sewing, at least, replacing your sewing machine needle. The second notion I wanted to talk about is your sewing pins. Now, we have classes and sit and stitches here in the shop, and I'm always amazed at the pins that I see people using. Some of them are like nails, they are so thick. So the first thing I want to talk about with pins is you should be using a nice, thin, smooth, sharp pin. That way your fabric won't be distorted as you pin. I mean, pins are essential. Now, I know not everyone pins, but pins are really a great way to control all those layers of fabric as you're sewing. So pins usually need to be replaced about once a year. Again, just like your sewing machine needle, the point of your pin can get dull and cause runs in your fabric. Also, the pins these days have a nickel coating on them, and over time that nickel coating can start to wear off, and there is a potential that needles could rust. And I would hope that you aren't pinning your fabric and leaving it for long periods of time like that, but it does happen that we step away from projects sometimes. So if your pin were to get damp and rust, it would damage your fabric, and that probably would be very hard to get rust out of your fabric. The other thing that happens over time with nice thin pins is they do start to bend over time. And as the pins bend, they don't hold your fabric as well. So I actually keep a little plastic container, maybe something that, had Parmesan cheese or something in it. And as like a pin gets too bent, or when I go to put it through my fabric and it doesn't go nice and smoothly in my fabric, I just throw it into that little plastic bin. That way, when I throw it away, I'm not having loose, sharp pins in my trash can that could hurt or poke someone who was emptying the trash. That would be my husband, who would not be happy about being poked. So pins should be replaced usually about once a year. Now let's move on to the last notion, and that is our rotary blades. Now, rotary blades, I can't give you a set amount of time as to when they're going to be replaced, because it really does depend on how much cutting you're doing, the condition of your mat, your cutting mat, and sometimes The rotary blade can hit something that you have on your mat, a pencil, a pen, scissors, something like that, and you can damage the blade if you're hit it with something. So when your rotary blade gets old, you'll find that you're pressing very hard when you're using it, and you will find that it may not cut smoothly. So you might run your rotary blade and not all the fabric is cut. You might have little areas that aren't cut. And you don't want to have to start running your blade 2 and 3 times over your fabric, because if your ruler moves, now your cut is no longer accurate. Personally, every time I change my rotary blade, at that first cut with the new blade, my first thought is, why did I wait so long to change my blade? I had no idea I was working so hard cutting. And so when you change your blade, you're going to have a lot less fatigue in your hands and your shoulders. You are going to cut more accurately. Cutting is going to be so much easier, and it's just so much better. So the rotary blade, you just have to play it by ear, but it is important to change it as it gets older to do yourself a favor and enjoy your cutting more. So I hope that's helpful, and you can always visit fabricgardenquiltshop.com and visit our notions section to get yourself some fresh pins and sewing machine needles and rotary cutters. Thanks for joining me.